Very good afternoon. I think we're ready to start our press conference. So welcome to this press conference with a fact-finding mission on Libya. Joining us are the three members of the fact-finding mission. In the center is Mohammed Ajwar, the chair, Tracy Robinson to my right, and Chaluka Bayani on my far right. The mission members are here to present their first report. The report is now online. It's available in English and Arabic. Eventually, other languages will follow. Also available is an accompanying press release in English and Arabic as well. The embargo has been lifted on this report in the press release. You should have also received this by email a short while ago. And just to note that the fact-finding mission was created by the Human Rights Council in June 2020, and the three experts were appointed by the High Commissioner for Human Rights in August 2020. So today's report will be presented to the Human Rights Council this coming Thursday, the 7th of October. And before I turn to the members of the mission for their brief opening remarks, we'll screen a short video. So if I can ask my colleagues to start the video. Thank you.
أنا المفقود هشام محمد صالح هرودا، ولدي انخطف بتاريخ 3/8/2016 من قبل ميليشيات القاني. خطفوه لساعة اليوم. ولدي ما نعلمش بيه وين، اللي يقول انا نشدت ودورته في طرابلس قالوا لي في السجون السرية. انا ناشد المنظمة الأمم المتحدة وحقوق الإنسان، شوف لي ولدي وين، دور لي ولدي وين مصيره. وانا بعد 4 شهور قلت له ولدي الصغير واخوي في الاسعاف، وانا ناشد الامم المتحده وحقوق الانسان يشوفوا لي يدوروا لي مصير ولدي هشام وين في السجون السريه. وانا ما شوف ولدي ما نشوفش فيه الا في المنام، حتى الباب وان يطرق ونقول ولدي هو جاء نفرح.
استشهد اخوتي كريم مفقودين، لكن تو عرفناهم وجينا بحثنا عليهم. احنا قعدنا سنه لقيناهم مدفونين، لقيناهم 10 انفار مدفونين جميع. جونا يوم 21/12/2019 يوم السبت الظهر، والله العظيم قتلوهم بدم بارد. والله عندي واحد من اخوتي شهاده بالله هو يصلي قالوه.
انفرادي بعد الاستيقاظ عن اسبوع او اكثر، حيث كان كل ليله ياتوا المحققين ويحقوا معنا فشخصيا تم تحقيق معي مدة ما يقارب عن 7 أيام. كل ليلة نخرج ويضعوا القماش على عيوني على راسي أجل إني ما نشوفش حد يعني، ومصفد يدي بالقيود. كانوا يضعوني في ساحة، طبعا مع الإهانة والشد من الرقبة والملابس، وتقعد تصدم بالجدران بالأبواب لأنك ما تشوفش. ضربت على رأسي وعلى ظهري وعلى رجلي، ولما كنت نسقط يضربوني بالأرجل، بالإضافة طبعا يسب الأهل وتهديد بإحضار الأهل وغيره من الأساليب النفسية والجسدية.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn to Mr. Awjar for his remarks. He'll deliver his remarks initially in Arabic and repeat them in English, and then we'll turn to the other members of the mission for their brief remarks, and then to you for your questions. Mr. Awjar.
صباح الخير، مرحبا بكم في هذه الندوة الصحفية. اسمي محمد أوجار، أنا رئيس بعثة تقصي الحقائق المستقلة بشأن ليبيا. معي زميلاي المرموقان تريسي روبنسون وتشالوكا بياني. اليوم البعثة ستعلن وتنشر تقريرها حول وضعية حقوق الإنسان في ليبيا منذ 2016، والذي سيقدم لاحقا في بحر هذا الأسبوع أمام مجلس حقوق الإنسان كجزء من حوار تفاعلي حول ليبيا. إن بعثة تقصي الحقائق أنشئت في يونيو 2020 من طرف مجلس حقوق الإنسان، وكان مطلوبا منا أن نحقق في خروقات حقوق الإنسان وكل التجاوزات، وأيضا في الخروقات المتعلقة بالقانون الدولي الإنساني المرتكبة من طرف كل الأطراف في ليبيا منذ بداية 2016. ولقد نظرنا وحققنا أيضا في ادعاءات حول الجرائم الدولية المحتملة. لقد أعطينا ولاية واسعة وشاملة، ولكن ولاعتبارات تتعلق بالميزانية لم نتمكن من الشروع في تحقيقاتنا إلا منذ 3 أشهر. ورغم قصر هذه المدة فقد تمكنا من جمع مئات الوثائق، واستجوبنا 150 شخصا، وأجرينا تحقيقات في ليبيا وتونس وإيطاليا. إن الحجج والدلائل التي عثرنا عليها تؤكد وجود حالة مزرية وفظيعة لحقوق الإنسان. إن العنف والأزمة التي دخلت فيها ليبيا منذ سقوط نظام القذافي سنة 2011، ولكن وبصفة خاصة منذ سنة 2016، أدى إلى اقتراف خروقات جسيمة لحقوق الإنسان ضد كل الفئات الهشة، وخاصة المدنيين والنساء والأطفال والمهجرين والمهاجرين. لقد وجدنا أيضا دلائل تذهب إلى الاعتقاد بوجود جرائم حرب ارتكبت في ليبيا، في حين أن العنف الممارس في السجون والمرتكبة بصفة خاصة ضد المهاجرين يمكن أن يرقى إلى جرائم ضد الإنسانية. ولنختصر ما توصلنا إليه. إن تحقيقاتنا أثبتت أن كل الأطراف في هذا النزاع، وضمنها الدول الثالثة والمقاتلين الأجانب والمرتزقة، قد قاموا بخرق القانون الدولي الإنساني، وخاصة مبدأي التناسب والتمييز، وبعضهم ارتكب جرائم حرب. إن المدنيين دفعوا ثمنا غاليا خلال الاعتداءات سنة 2019-2020 على طرابلس، كما في كل المواجهات المسلحة. إن الغارات الجوية قتلت عشرات الأسر، كما أن تدمير المستشفيات أثر على الولوج إلى الصحة، والقنابل ضد الأشخاص والأفراد التي تركها المرتزقة في الأحياء السكنية قد قتلت وجرحت المدنيين. Good morning. Welcome to this press conference. My name is Mohamed Aujar and I am the chair of the Independent Fact-Finding Mission on Libya. With me are my fellow colleagues Chaluka Biani and Tracy Robinson. Today the FMM released its report on the human rights situation in Libya since 2016, which will be presented later this week on the Human Rights Council as a part of an interactive dialogue in Libya. Our fact-finding mission was established in June 2020 by the Human Rights Council, and we were requested to document alleged human rights violations and abuses, as well as violations of international humanitarian law committed by all parties in Libya since the beginning of 2016. We also looked into allegations of potential international crimes. We were given a very broad mandate. However, for budgetary reasons, we were only able to commence our investigations 3 months ago. In the limited time available, we gathered hundreds of documents, interviewed more than 150 individuals, and conducted investigations in Libya, Tunisia, and Italy. The finding which reached unveiled a dire human rights situation. The violence and the conflict that had plagued Libya since the fall of the Gaddafi regime in 2011, but particularly since 2016, had enabled the commission of gross human rights violations against the most vulnerable, including civilian, women, children, internally displaced persons, and migrants. We also found reasonable ground to believe that war crimes have been committed in Libya, while violence perpetrated in prisons and against migrants there may amount to crime against humanity. Let's briefly summarize our finding. Our investigations have established that all parties to the conflicts, including third state, foreign fighters, and mercenaries, have violated international humanitarian law, in particular the principle of proportionality and distinction. And some have also committed war crime. Civilians paid a heavy price during the 2019-2020 hostilities in Tripoli, as well as during other armed confrontations in the country since 2016. Airstrikes have killed dozens of families. The destruction of health-related facilities has impacted access to health care, and anti-personnel mines lifted by mercenaries in residential area have killed and maimed civilians. I will now give the floor to my colleague Tracy Robinson, who will address some of our other findings. Please, Tracy.
Thank you very much, Chair. We found evidence of disturbing patterns of violence committed in Libyan prisons, as you also saw in the video. A witness told us, and I quote, "More than 100 prisoners were isolated from the rest of the prison population. I was among them. Our families were no longer authorized to visit us. We were subjected to torture on a daily basis." End of quote. Arbitrary detention in secret prisons and unbearable conditions of detention are widely used by the state and militias against anyone perceived to be a threat to their interests or views. Violence in Libyan prisons is committed on such a scale and with such a level of organization that it may also potentially amount to crimes against humanity. Our report also documents the recruitment and direct participation of children in hostilities, the enforced disappearance and extrajudicial killings of prominent women, and continuing sexual and other forms of violence against vulnerable populations, including LGBTQI persons. We paid particular attention to the allegations of atrocity crimes committed in the town of Tarhuna to the southeast of Tripoli between 2016 and 2020. We were able to document the existence of mass graves in Tarhuna. I'll hand over to my colleague, Chiloka Biane, for the remaining findings.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Tracy. Our investigations also indicated that migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees are subjected to a litany of abuses at sea, in detention centers, and at the hands of traffickers. Violations against migrants are committed on a widespread scale by state and non-state actors with a high level of organization and with encouragement of the state. All of this is suggestive of crimes against humanity. The chronic insecurity in Libya has also led to the internal displacement of hundreds of thousands of people who have ended up in areas ill-equipped to accommodate large-scale movements. Some ethnic groups, such as the Tuaregs, the Tebus, and the Al-Ahali, have been displaced since 2011 and continue facing severe abuses. The evidence indicated that Libya has failed to take action to ensure the safety of internally displaced persons and their return to their place of origin in breach of its obligations under international law. Let me give the floor back to our chair at this point in time. Thank you.
The findings we present today are not exhaustive. Further investigation are required to comprehensively address the situation of human rights in Libya since 2016. Our report recommends the Human Rights Council to extend the fact-finding mission mandate for further year to this end. Through its mandate, this mission closely engaged with civil society. We acknowledge that the important work of NGOs carry out. They bring forward the voice of those who have endured violations and abused. We value very much the contribution they made to our fact-finding mission. We need We noted with concern that Libyan-based NGOs were reluctant to interact with us in the view of the Presidential Council Decree of 2019 regulating the work of NGOs in Libya. They felt that notifying government authorities about their intent to meet with the mission would expose them to retaliations. We urged Libya to review this presidential decree to ensure the NGO can approach us without fear and in full confidence. In closing, as Libyans try to secure peace, ensuring accountability for gross human rights violations and international crimes committed in the country is more necessary than ever to deter further violations and promote long-term peace and reconciliation. We urge Libya to intensify its effort to hold those responsible to account. It is also essential that the international community continue to provide support to the Libyan judicial authorities. Thank you for attention. We remain at your disposal to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thanks to the three of you for your opening remarks. We now turn to you, colleagues, for your questions. I see a few hands up already. We start with Stephanie Nebehe of Reuters. If we can unmute Stephanie, please. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Yes, thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the report. I wondered if you could elaborate, please, a bit on the findings that the mission has found about the Russian mercenaries, specifically Wagner. If you can say whether you have additional allegations and whether some of those fighters' names may figure on your list, and to the extent to which they are still present in Libya. So sort of a two-part question, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, Reuters. Indeed, our investigations have indicated that there are foreign fighters, there are mercenaries in Libya, and they have not yet left the territory of Libya as required. I think that in particular, our investigations have indicated that there are individuals associated with Shivik Wagner, which is a private military company from Russia. And this particular military company has been involved in attacks in southern Tripoli. There was a September 2019 attack, for example. Landmines have been planted between April to May in about 35 locations. And therefore, clearly, our findings are that indeed there are foreign fighters and mercenaries in Libya. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chaloka. Now we have a question from Jamie Keaton of Associated Press.
Hi.
Go ahead, Jamie.
Can you hear me? Thank you. This is Jamie from Associated Press. Yeah, my question is a little bit similar to that of Stephanie, but in your conclusions in part 5 of the report, it says, mindful of the need to ensure justice for victims, the mission has identified individuals and groups, both Libyan and foreign actors, who may bear responsibility for the violations and abuses under investigations. And you mentioned that additional time and resources are required. Could you just give us a little bit more about that international responsibility? You mentioned the Wagner Group, as Stephanie noted, but what other foreign players may have some responsibility in this? And if I could just add to that, what is the message that you send to the European Union, which has, of course, struck a deal with the Libyan Coast Guard to help step up interdiction efforts across the Mediterranean? What message should Brussels take away from this report?
Again, thank you very much, Jamie from the Associated Press. Indeed, there are individuals and groups that have been identified so far. I think the investigations that we have carried out are centered very much on victims, leading, of course, the identification of alleged perpetrators. But our investigations are still at an early stage to actually release any names at this point in time. which is why we point out the fact that we need additional time and resources. You'll be aware that the mandate of the FFM has actually expired, and it needs renewal perhaps for a significant period of time to be able to carry out investigations from until 2016. In terms of messages from the EU, we note, of course, that there is a case pending before the European Court of Human Rights on the involvement, essentially, of some European states, in particular Italy, on training the Libyan Coast Guard and the responsibilities that are involved in that regard. So whilst we are not naming any third states from the EU at this point in time, but it's quite clear that the pullback policies, the pushback policies at sea have led to huge violations of human rights on the part of migrants, leading to detention in Libya upon return. And as our report indicates, this is one of the areas where we think that crimes against humanity have been committed. Thank you.
Thanks to you. We'll take a question from the room. It's Musa of Al Mayadeen. Go ahead, Musa.
Merci رونالد. سؤالي بالعربية. أنا موسى عاصي من قناة الميادين. Je traduirai après peut-être.
If you can pose a question in French.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Je vais la réponse en arabe et puis après il peut traduire s'il veut en anglais. Ouais. سؤالي حول التقرير. مرة في هذا التقرير فقرة عن دور المرتزقة السوريين في ليبيا، وهناك مقابلات قد جرت مع هؤلاء وتحدثوا كيف أتوا إلى ليبيا وماذا يفعلون، وإن كان ذلك من أجل المال أو غير المال. إذا كان لو سمحت ممكن يعني تذكر بهذا الدور، بدور المرتزقة السوريين كيف أتوا إلى ليبيا وما هو دورهم فعلا. Ma question à propos des mercenaires syriens qui ont été amenés l'année dernière en Libye, ou bien les 2 dernières années en Libye, quel est le rôle de ces mercenaires en Libye et pourquoi ils sont là? Et parce que j'ai vu dans le rapport du comité qu'il y a eu des interviews avec ces combattants, ces mercenaires, et puis ils disaient qu'ils sont là pour l'argent. Alors j'aimerais qu'il explique un petit peu ce point. Merci.
شكرا جزيلا. التقرير الذي تقدمنا به يشير إلى تورط كثير من الأطراف في اقتراف خروقات جسيمة لحقوق الإنسان ضمن المتورطين المقاتلين الأجانب والمرتزقة. رغم قصر المدة استجوبنا 150 شخصا، ضمنهم الفئة التي تتحدث عنها وتورطهم ومسؤولياتهم في ارتكاب خروقات جسيمة ثابتة. في المقبل من الأيام إذا مدد مجلس حقوق الإنسان ولايتنا، وهو الاتجاه الذي يسير فيه المجلس هذه الأيام، سندقق في المسؤوليات وسنأتي بمزيد من الدلائل حول تورط كل الجهات المقترفة لحقوق الإنسان. شكرا. En réponse à cette question, j'avais expliqué que le rapport avait établi la responsabilité des États, la responsabilité des mercenaires, la responsabilité des combattants étrangers dans les violations très graves des droits de l'homme sur l'ensemble du territoire libyen. Nous avons pendant ces 3 mois pu réaliser nos investigations et réaliser des interviews avec plus de 150 personnes. Nous avons estimé que nous avons besoin d'extension de mandat vu la complexité de la situation en Libye pour pouvoir approfondir nos investigations et établir les responsabilités de tous de toutes les forces étatiques, combattants étrangers et mercenaires sur le territoire libyen. Merci.
Merci à vous. We have a question now from Laurent Sierra, Swiss News Agency. Go ahead, Laurent.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. So you mentioned that pattern of that may amount to crimes against humanity. We know how Libya has been divided in the last years. So is it a pattern that you could observe in every region of the country, in the western part, the eastern part, and the southern part of the country? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You'll notice that we make findings of likely crimes against humanity in the context of migration in particular, also in the context of persons deprived of liberty. We are still in the early stages of investigation, and so in respect of detention, we have identified possible crimes of humanity in the prisons and places of detention that we have been able to closely investigate, but we recognize that there is still a need to more fully investigate this question. In respect of migration, you'd imagine this is happening most closely in the places where we also have had access. So to answer your question, we have not had as much access to the south of the country in our investigations. We hope in the next round, if the mandate is extended, to be able to more fully investigate in the south. And we have noted in respect of the two specific issues where the report makes this particular finding, general concerns about the potential for classification of crimes against humanity in the areas which we have had access for the purposes of investigation.
Thank you. We have a question now from Isabel Sacco of the Spanish News Agency. Isabel, go ahead. Go ahead, Isabel. No, okay. One more second. Okay, we may have to come back to Isabel. We'll move on to Barbara Bibbo, Al Jazeera. Barbara, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions and a clarification as well to ask. Did you say, Mrs. Robinson, that you didn't have access to the south because you didn't have enough time to visit the south as well, or did I get what you said correctly? And did you have unimpeded access to all locations across the country that you wanted to visit? And then one question is about the use of Syrian children, Syrian child soldiers by Turkey in Libya. I wanted to ask if you were able to intercept or speak directly to any of these children, and how do you treat acts of war or violations committed by children employed in war, like in this case? And then one clarification about, you mentioned in your Access 1 to the report that your investigation is overlapping with the investigation of the International Criminal Court that started back in 2011. What does it mean technically? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and perhaps I'll share the question with Chaloka as well. To respond to your first question about access to the South, I think the constraints were multiple in accessing the South. There is an ongoing security concern about access to the South of the country. I think the second concern was simply the late access which we had to Libya in our investigations. We have had a short time in this current mandate, and that meant in addition to visas which were issued late in the day, that we had limited time in general in our investigations in Libya. But I think one of the principal concerns was the security risks as assessed in visiting the South. You also asked about all locations in the country which we wished to visit, and did we have otherwise access to those. I think we should acknowledge that there were some constraints in visiting some locations. And we hope that if the mandate is extended, that those constraints, for whatever reason, it may have been additional security or other requirements, that those will be addressed in the future. But we also acknowledge that we faced logistical difficulties given the limited time we had available once visas were issued, and we acknowledge the government's willingness to address that concern in the future. That we also wish to also make sure that civil society and NGOs who wish to meet with the FFM, if the mandate is extended, have full access to it. So I think it's one question about having access to all locations. There's another important concern that those who wish to speak to the FFM and share information with us as witnesses or victims should be able in the future, if the mandate is extended, to do so. In respect of Syrian child soldiers, I'm going to hand over to Chaloka specifically for the question of acts committed by children and overlapping mandates with the ICC.
Thank you very much, Tracy. I would also like to reinforce that we've actually been operative since June 2020. Yeah. So the report that we have has been done in about 4 months. So more time is needed for us to have access to the most important areas in the country where violations have been committed. So we are focused very much at this point in time on grave commissions, essentially, of atrocities and other violations. And of course, if the mandate is renewed, then we'll extend our investigations throughout. In the context of children and how children are tried, well, our role is not actually to carry out any trials at all. Our role is simply to fact find and document the evidence that is necessary, and which other actors, perhaps the ICC or in future mechanism, may be able to use. So yes, our mandate does overlap with the ICC, and we do share some information, some cooperation. However, the ICC is a prosecuting agency. Yeah, we don't have that. I think it's quite clear that the recruitment of children into armed groups or armed forces is unlawful under international law. You just have to look to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, for example. But international human rights law also is clear that children are both perpetrators and victims. So they have to be looked at from that point of view in any measure that may be taken against them. Yes, we have come across evidence of children that may have been brought from Syria to participate in the conflict in Libya. I think the details of that are in the report itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. Now we'll try Isabel again. If we can unmute Isabel, please. Isabel? Okay. It seems that we're having some technical difficulties. We'll then move to Nick of the New York Times.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Go ahead.
I wonder if you could just give us a little bit more detail about how much time you did have in country and where you were able to go and who you were able to see, and whether you did indeed have access to any places of detention. And secondly, in reference to the treatment of migrants, You reference a high degree of organization, you reference participation of state bodies and militias. Are you saying that there was coordination between them? And can we say, therefore, or conclude that the state was profiting financially from trafficking and the treatment of these migrants? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will refer the question on where we went and whom we saw, I think, to Tracy, because I was not able to actually go to Libya because of COVID circumstances, but our colleagues can provide more information on that. But on the situation of migrants and the participation of non-state actors and the state, it is not that there's actually a collusion as such. There are migrants who are detained in certain detention centers. Some of those detention centers are run by militias. There are also centers that are obviously detention facilities that are run by the state itself. And that is the indication that we make in relation to the report. We're not indicating that the state itself somehow benefited from this collusion at all. There's a degree of trafficking and smuggling of migrants, which is a huge business, obviously. And this is a business that is run by the traffickers themselves, and also perhaps in collusion with some of the armed groups and militia. But the responsibility of the state, of course, is to protect human rights, to carry out investigations in the context of violations, and the failure to do so then entails state responsibility. I think that's the hallmark of the direction of our inquiry at this point in time.
Thank you very much. To respond, Nick, to your questions about how much time we spent in country, I think I should distinguish between the investigators visiting Libya, which they did in the course of the 4 months we had to work, and then the fact-finding mission and its members visited Libya as well. How much time? Approximately a week in both cases. Where did we go? We were primarily focused we're primarily focused in the Tripoli region and the environs. Who did we see and speak to? Significantly, particularly for the FFM, we spoke primarily to state actors. They included government officials in various ministries, some key prosecutors who had responsibility for accountability for violations, the judiciary at the highest level. We also, the investigators also met with some witnesses, but noted the reluctance of witnesses to speak to them given the heavy level of security which was required. And of course, we did not speak to NGOs during our mission there, either as members or as investigators, because we recognized that the presidential decree for NGOs posed grave concerns about their own risks to retaliation if they were in contact with us. Did we have access to places of detention? We made requests to have access to places of detention. To date, we haven't yet had permission, and we certainly hope if the mandate is extended that this becomes an important source of access for the FFM in its continued work.
Please go ahead. Please.
Thank you very much, Tracy. I think we have to note that one of the constraining factors was the huge security presence in relation to the investigators, which made the investigators visible. And that obviously does pose some degree of difficulty in relation to the witnesses and the persons that you wish to speak to, because they would be at risk. Our defining principle is to do no harm in this particular regard. So that was a matter of concern. for us in that regard. I think in terms of the actual timing, our investigators went in July. As Tracy said, the fact-finding mission went in August, but quite clearly our capacity to see whom we want to see and at which point in time may be constrained by the factors that my colleague Tracy mentioned. We can't speak to local NGOs because there is a law that forbids them from doing so. And if they did, of course, there would be certain consequences in relation, to them. We also paid great attention to Tahuna because of the gravity of the crimes that have been committed there, especially mass graves, as it turns out, and it still remains our area of interest. We have plans to go to Benghazi as well in the next mission of investigation to be carried out. So we are keen to discharge our mandate, which says investigations, violations of international human rights law, international humanitarian law throughout the territory of Libya and in relation to all sides. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chaluka and Tracy. We'll just try one more time with Isabel. If not, I have a question that she's posed, but if we could try to unmute her just to see if she could pose herself. Okay, it seems that. All right, sorry, Isabel. Anyway, I'll deliver it on your behalf if you don't mind. The question is as follows. She asks if about the responsibility of jihadist groups in concerning human rights violations during the period corresponding to the mission mandate, and what seems to be their presence now. If I got that right. Yes, so jihadist groups in connection with human rights violations. If one of you can answer that, please.
Well, jihadist groups are non-state actors. And as non-state actors, of course, they bear responsibility for their acts. And one of the reasons why we're created is clearly to document the nature of the violations engaged by non-state actors themselves as jihadist groups. And so here we have looked at the conduct in relation to armed conflict. We have looked at extrajudicial killings. We have looked at enforced disappearances. We have looked at sexual and gender-based violence, of course. And we have also looked at the issue of migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, as well as internally displaced persons, from the point of view of both international human rights law, but also from the point of view of international humanitarian law. In the context of international humanitarian law, you'll be aware that the jihadist groups obviously bear individual criminal responsibility, for which they may be held accountable. And the whole purpose is to make sure that accountability in the context of the conduct of hostilities in Libya would be the hallmark going forward, both in terms of dealing with impunity, as well as in facilitating reconciliation amongst the Libyan people themselves. In terms of location, again, in and around Tripoli, clearly there are jihadist groups operating there. In the area of Benghazi as well, there are jihadist groups. So we can't actually say we have ABC as such, because we're not looking in groups as such. We're looking into the evidence of violations by whomsoever. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't scroll down far enough. She was asking in particular the case of ISIS, but we could also, I suppose, you can qualify that. Otherwise, we can discuss that with you afterwards, Isabel. If perhaps we can go back to Stephanie with another question. Stephanie Nebehe, Reuters. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please. The report points to, multiple incidents or alleged violations by forces of General Haftar and the LNA. Can you say whether the investigators, contribute to any concerns you may have about his being likely to stand for presidential election. Thank you.
Well, that's not actually so much within the scope of our mandate in terms of elections, that are going to take place in December, and who may be standing or who may not be standing. But what our report does furnish, of course, is credible evidence of violations in relation to those that are attributable to it, whether it's the Libyan National Army or whether it's the GNLA. For us, there's no face. The only face that we follow is where the evidence leads us to. So in the context of elections, of course, our work will help in relation to establishing the parameters of accountability and ultimately perhaps identifying the individuals that may be involved. As to what happens thereafter, I think is within the purview of the United Nations and of course of the Libyan government itself. Thank you.
Sorry, Nick, did you have a follow-up or just?
Yes, I do, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. You spoke about the Tahuna area. I wondered what you could say about the mass graves that you've visited or the locations, what you know about the number of victims in these mass graves, what you know about the perpetrators who put them there, and what is the status of investigation into the incidents that led to those mass graves? Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for the follow-up question on Tahuna. I think this is one area in which there is a strong need for additional time to further investigate. The scale of the atrocities in Tahuna demand far more focused attention, including forensic investigations. These have begun on our part. You'll see in the report what we have found to date, but take note as well that the fact-finding mission has begun to confidentially hold a list across its work of those who may be responsible for the various violations that it has identified. At this stage, it remains a confidential report, but on the Tahuna situation, far more time and resources will be required. And certainly this is one of the big reasons to support a call for the extension of the mandate of the FFM. I should also add, in relation to an earlier question, to also emphasize that the mission also met with DCIM, the government agency with responsibility for migration, and had extensive discussions with them about the situation of migration across the country. Thanks very much.
So I think we could end it there then. I'd like to thank you very much to the members of the fact-finding mission for joining us, and of course to you for joining us online and here in person. I should just mention that the Human Rights Council does have a draft resolution before it, which does call for the extension of the mandate of the fact-finding mission. That will be discussed either Thursday or Friday this week. This report will be presented on Thursday, the 7th of October. And I should also mention that the opening remarks that were delivered by the members of the mission will be posted on their website shortly, the same link I shared with you earlier. So thanks very much again, and have a good afternoon.
So may I add some words?
Of
Yes,
course.
yeah.
Go ahead, please.
So just to congratulate our staff, our investigators, and all the effort they made on the ground. I hope that our mandate will be extended to continue our investigations, and we request a free and a full access to all the regions in Libya. We haven't been to Benghazi, haven't been to the south, even the Libyan authorities were very supportive of the establishment of the FFM. The relationship between the FFM and the Libyan authorities wasn't always easy. So as you understand, we have our first visit on the ground was at the end of last of August. I hope sincerely that our mandate will be extended and we'll try to build a good cooperation with the Libyan authorities, and we request for a free and a full access to all the Libyan authorities, the whole Libyan territory. Thank you very much.
Merci encore. Thank you and shukran. Thank you. Bye-bye.